After the war ended and the world slowly began to rebuild itself, ships full of soldiers returned home, carrying men who had survived years of blood, smoke, and longing. And among them was Sergeant Paul Sutton, a man who stepped off the dock with the quiet hope of simply resuming his life and building the future he had dreamed about in countless letters written during lonely nights at the front, a future where he and his wife Betty would start a family, live in peace, and leave the shadow of war behind. But as Paul stood among the crowd of cheering families, his hopeful smile faltered and then died altogether when he realized that everyone around him was being swallowed by embraces, lifted into the air by laughing fathers, kissed by wives, clung to by children, while he remained a solitary figure standing in the draft their joy created, scanning the crowd once, then again, slower, as if perhaps he had missed her in the first sweep. But there was no mistake. Betty was not there, and the noisy joy of reunion all around him made the silence in his corner of the dock deafening, so he adjusted his duffel bag on his shoulder, touched the locket with Betty's picture that still hung around his neck, and walked away from the dock with his steps growing heavier with every block he crossed until he finally reached the apartment they had shared before his deployment, where he opened the door and found Betty, startled, standing in pale green lingerie as though she had been waiting for someone else, and though she rushed to him, pulling him into an embrace, there was a hesitation in her eyes, a small guilt that made Paul freeze for a moment before he kissed her back. But even in that moment, he noticed the stack of unopened letters neatly stored away in a trunk, letters he had written almost every single day during his 4 years at war, and when he asked why she had never mentioned receiving them in her replies, Betty sheepishly admitted that she had stopped reading them because the descriptions of battle were too much for her to handle, though she had saved them all. And though Paul's heart sank at the thought that the words he had clung to as his lifeline had never even reached her eyes, he said nothing, swallowing his hurt, forgiving her silently because all he wanted was to hold on to the dream of love and peace he had been fighting for. And later that night, as Betty spoke excitedly about the economic boom and how she had convinced Paul's old chocolate company to take him back, he sat quietly, listening, until he said that he no longer wanted to sell chocolates, that he had written about the life he wanted for them, full of children and quiet mornings and a sense of belonging. But since Betty only spoke of money and the better life it could buy, he finally nodded, agreeing to her plans, even though they felt like surrender. And by dawn, Paul had put on his uniform again, kissed Betty's sleeping forehead, and boarded the train for Sacramento to start again as a chocolate salesman, determined to keep his promise even if it felt hollow now. On the train, Paul noticed a young woman struggling to lift her suitcase onto the rack, and when it fell, spilling its contents, including a framed photograph that broke, he immediately sprang up to help her, only to end up awkwardly tumbling forward as the train swayed, so that he landed near her feet, just as she turned pale and vomited on his uniform. An accident that might have angered another man, but only made Paul chuckle as he reassured her that it was all right, disappearing into the washroom to clean up without complaint. And later, exhausted, he fell asleep and was pulled into the kind of war dream that never really lets go, waking up with a start and grateful to find himself still on the train, only to discover that the young woman was gone, her seat empty, her presence vanished like a brief vision. But when Paul changed trains in San Francisco, he was surprised to see her again at the bus station, sitting nervously with her ticket in her hand, and after a brief exchange, they realized their tickets had been switched during their earlier collision, a mishap that made her feel guilty, though Paul brushed it off with easy kindness, and she finally introduced herself as Victoria Aragon, a graduate student heading back to her family's Napa Valley vineyard, Las Nubes. And for a brief time, the two of them rode in companionable silence until two drunken men staggered onto the bus and began to harass Victoria, ignoring her pleas to leave her alone until Paul's soldier instincts took over. And with quiet precision he stood, told them to back off, and when they refused, he beat them both until they were thrown off the bus with him, leaving him and Victoria on the side of the road, where she sat down on her suitcase, tears streaking her face, and admitted that she was terrified of going home because she was pregnant by a professor who had abandoned her, and she feared her father would cast her out or worse if she showed up unmarried. And Paul, seeing her distress and feeling an old protective instinct stirring, offered to pretend to be her husband for a single night so she could face her family without shame, a plan she reluctantly agreed to because she had no other choice. As they approached Las Nubes, the vineyard glowed in the late afternoon sun, the hills like waves of gold, the air scented with grapes, and for a moment Paul forgot the weight of war, forgot Betty, forgot everything except the strange pull of this land and the girl beside him, and before they stepped into the courtyard, he twisted a foil wrapper from one of his chocolates into a ring and slid it onto her finger, slipping another onto his own hand so the lie would be complete. But as soon as they entered, a rifle shot split the air, and they found Victoria's father, Alberto, waiting with his gun, demanding to know who this man was, and when Victoria said, "My husband," Alberto's fury exploded as he shouted for the rest of the family, bringing them all out of the house, filling the courtyard with noise and surprise as they rushed to greet Victoria, hugging her, kissing her, laughing, though Alberto's face remained like stone, and that night at dinner he interrogated Paul about his past, sneering when he learned that Paul was an orphan, a man with no family and no heritage, and saying that a man with no past had no future, a man unworthy of marrying into their bloodline. And though Paul felt the words like blows, he kept his composure, thanked them for the meal, and slipped out into the night air, where Victoria found him and apologized. But Paul said he understood Alberto's anger, because if a stranger had come into his house and said he had married his daughter, he might act the same way. That night, Paul slept on the floor of the master bedroom that had been given to them. But when Alberto barged in to say goodnight, his eyes landed on the blanket, and though he said nothing, the look he gave them made Paul scramble to climb into bed beside Victoria, where they lay stiffly for a long time before finally relaxing, the air between them warm and fragile, and when the frost bells rang before dawn, Paul leapt up with the rest of the household and followed them into the vineyards, where he learned to use the fire wings, flapping them through the rows of vines to push heat over the grapes until the sun finally rose and the vines were saved. And Alberto, watching from a distance, said nothing but seemed to weigh Paul differently now. The next day, Don Pedro, Victoria's grandfather, took Paul on a walk through the vineyard, showing him the hill where the first vine had been planted centuries ago, telling him that an orphan is simply a man waiting to discover his family, and offering Paul the choice to be part of theirs. Words that moved Paul deeply, though he said he still had to leave, until Don Pedro warned him that Victoria would pay the price if he went too soon, and so Paul stayed through the harvest, working alongside the family, picking grapes, carrying boxes, even laughing as he crushed grapes in the vat with the other workers, while Victoria danced beside him. And when the music played, he and Victoria came together as if gravity itself was pulling them closer. And later that night, they kissed, a kiss that felt like it could change everything, until Paul pulled back, breathless, saying that he loved her but could not betray his marriage, leaving Victoria to cry quietly into her pillow, while Paul stared at the ceiling, his heart pounding with everything he wanted, but could not have. When a quarrel erupted the next morning between Pedro and Alberto over whether to modernize the vineyard, Paul tried to mediate, suggesting loans, but Alberto shouted at him to stay out of family matters, which only pushed Paul to say that Victoria's happiness was his concern. And later, when she was doubled over in pain, he rushed to her side, only for her to say bitterly that it was not his problem and that no one could help her, leaving him feeling helpless. And that night Don Pedro pressed brandy into Paul's hand and convinced him to serenade Victoria under her window. So with the help of a mariachi band, Paul sang until his voice cracked, and though her lamp stayed dark until the very last moment, it finally flickered on, giving him hope. But the next morning he left anyway, determined not to live a lie any longer. At the wine blessing, Alberto stunned everyone by announcing that there would be a wedding that night, and Paul whispered to Victoria that they had to end this, and she agreed, stepping forward to confess everything, that she was pregnant, that Paul was not her husband, that it had all been a lie. And as the family struggled to take in the news, Paul slipped away, hitchhiking back to Betty's apartment, only to find her in bed with another man, and though her words were not cruel, they were final. She told him that the life he wanted was not the life she would ever want, that she had already filed for annulment, and that he should sign the papers, which he did, leaving the apartment feeling dazed but strangely free. And for the first time since stepping off the ship, he smiled, because now he could go back to Victoria with nothing holding him back. When he reached Las Nubes, he found Alberto deep in drink, brittle with wounded pride, and asked for permission to marry Victoria, pledging to raise her child as his own. But Alberto refused, fought him with his fists, and in his drunken rage hurled an oil lamp that missed Paul and set the vineyard ablaze, the fire racing across the fields like a living thing. And though everyone fought to stop it, by dawn Las Nubes was nothing but blackened earth and smoke, and Don Pedro wept, believing their legacy was gone, until Paul climbed the hill, dug in the ash, and found the charred root of the original vine, which still held life in its core. And when Alberto cut into it and saw the green beneath the blackened bark, he realized that everything was not lost, that life could still grow, and he turned to Paul, finally seeing him not as an intruder, but as family, cutting a living shoot from the vine and handing it to Paul to replant as a symbol of trust. And in that moment, Paul took Victoria's hand, slid a real ring onto her finger, and kissed her as the family cheered, the smoke of loss still rising around them, but no longer feeling like an ending. Because together they would plant again, tend the vines, wait for new growth, and rebuild not just the vineyard, but the life Paul had dreamed of since the war, the life he had almost lost but finally found, a life where the orphan had a family, where love and hope took root again under the clouds. And that is how Paul, the man who returned from war with nothing but a promise in his heart, found love, family, and a place to call home beneath the clouds of Las Nubes. If you enjoyed this story and want to experience more epic movie tales brought to life, make sure to hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and share this video with someone who loves a good story as much as you do.